Welcome. I'm Dr. Mohader, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable. I will be starting the roundtable and introducing the speakers. My co-organizer, Dr. Andrew Tomlinson from the Institute for Transport Studies at the UK, University of Leeds, will guide the Q&A and close the session. Mobility and cinema, their mutual influence. In this roundtable, we will discuss how cinema and mobility have impacted and continue to impact each other, both in good and not so good ways. I have a quick poll. It was meant to be two separate questions, but they happen to be in the same poll. So please go ahead and share your thought. First, does cinema influence future of mobility, or does it simply portray what is there? And the second one, did you ever make a choice or change a behavior because of a movie? I did something, sorry. For those who missed it, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Please, if you could answer the question. A few more seconds. Perfect. Excellent. So most people believe that cinema influences mobility. So welcome, great to be here. We have a lot to talk about, and more than half believe that have made changes because of a movie. So we can ask our speakers about that too. We have three amazing, excellent speakers today. Professor Pamela Wojcik, chair of Department of Film, Television, and Theater at University of Notre, US. Master Ezra Glenn, lecturer in urban planning and community development, and curator of the MIT Planning Film Series at MIT in the US. And Mr. Steve Harper, automotive, transport and product designer and creative futurist at SHADO Design in the UK. So we're going to jump right in with our first speaker, Professor Pam Wojcik. Pam, please.
Let me pull up my screen. Okay, you can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thinking about mobility in cinema, of course, mobility is at the heart of cinema. Cinema, motion pictures, the movies do not exist without movement, whether one means the movement through a projector that brings images to life, the movement of film reels to cinemas across the globe, or the movements of film crews to locations near and far. Mobilities are also the stuff of cinematic representation. Oh, there we go. In Siegfried Krakauer's famous formulation, film renders the world in motion. Take any film you can think of. By dint of its very nature, it is a succession of ever-changing images, which altogether give the impression of flow, a constant movement. And there is, of course, no film that would not represent, or rather feature, things moving. Movement is the alpha and omega of the medium. Linking movement to precarity, Krakauer claims that cinema is concerned with the flow of life, which entails, on the one hand, a sense of life's haphazard contingencies, and on the other, life's open-endedness. Contingency for Krakauer is counter to fate or determinism and allows for possibility and change. Contingency also entails insecurity and uncertainty or precariousness. Indeed, some form of precarity would seem to be the engine driving any screen fiction insofar as something needs to be destabilized, the inciting incident of narrative cinema, for anything to happen. And more open-ended narratives give more play to uncertainty. Miriam Hansen suggests that cinema was the single most inclusive cultural horizon in which the traumatic effects of modernity were reflected, rejected, disavowed, transmuted, or negotiated, a matrix for the articulation of fantasies, uncertainties, and anxieties associated with modernity. As a key component of modernity, cinema not only represents mobilities, but also negotiates, transmutes, articulates anxieties, and fashions understandings of mobility. As Tim Creswell suggests, mobility is a pliant term, a kind of blank space that stands as an alternative to place, boundedness, foundations, and stability. The meanings of mobility can vary dramatically, depending upon how place, stability, and fixity are defined, and via privilege and precarity. Neither the freedom to be mobile nor the ability to stay put is ever accorded equally. Thus, ideas of mobility not only vary according to which kind of mobility one discusses, travel versus migration, for example, voluntary migration versus involuntary, the figure of the flaneur versus the homeless, but also in which community at which historical moment in time. And I think issues of mobility and placelessness and being stuck are very alive for us all now following lockdowns. Today, I just want to talk briefly about my current book project, Unhomed, Mobility and Placelessness in American Cinema, which examines America's ambivalent and shifting attitude toward mobility and placelessness through filmic representation of marginalized figures of mobility. Unhomed examines films that show characters as unhomed and placeless, mobile rather than fixed, failing, resisting, or opting out of the mandate for a home of one's own. Rather than focus strictly on poverty, the book examines different forms of unhoming and mobility in films to explore different meanings of precarity and placelessness. These films suggest the degree to which ideas of home and fixity in America depend upon othering certain modes of mobility while promulgating others. They show a tension in the American imaginary between viewing homelessness as, on the one hand, deviance or threat, and on the other as freedom and independence. The study points to changing ideals in America regarding the status of home, poverty, work, populism, class, community, trust, and social mobility. It provides ways of thinking about what it means to be domiciled, who can choose to be unhomed, and how mobility is defined through privilege and precarity. Unhomed considers mobility and placelessness in 5 different historical moments and distinct film cycles. As short-term market-driven clusters of films, film cycles, as Amanda Klein demonstrates, retain the marks of their historical, economic, and generic contexts, and therefore can reveal much about the state of contemporary politics, prevalent social ideologies, aesthetic trends, popular desires, and anxieties. By looking at distinct film cycles, Unhomed seeks to explore why and how ideas about mobility and placelessness come to the fore at certain moments in time, and how they change over time. Throughout the book, each cycle of films is read in context, in conversation with economic, social, and political discourse of the time, to situate the interest in mobility within its historical moment. Across each chapter, I'll explore attitudes toward figures of mobility in relation to gender, race, and sexuality. And I'm just going to break out the different chapters quickly. So the first chapter is about tramps and the long cycle of tramp films from 1895 to 1945. And there's hundreds and hundreds. If you take out Chaplin, there's still 600 films about tramps. The figure of the tramp offers a seemingly counter-hegemonic image of masculinity that flips the script to privilege unemployment over employment, begging or stealing over earning, being single over being married, mobility over home, unfettered sexuality over reproduction. However, while the cinematic tramp's masculinity is defined in opposition to hegemonic masculinity, it nonetheless works like hegemonic masculinity to subordinate others, notably feminized elites, immigrants, non-whites, women, and homosexuals. And it proves its power by occupying the very women's and domestic spaces it rejects. Chapter 2 considers mobility and placelessness through the figure of the soldier during World War II in films in a cycle from the early 40s through the 50s that encompass films about soldiers on leave, on base, abroad, and particularly returning home. While the experience of displacement is narrativized as part of the war effort, it also registers as freedom from and/or failure to meet societal expectations about masculinity. Chapter 3 examines two cycles. Primarily, it focuses on women adrift in a brief but very intense cycle of hitchhiker films in the late 60s and early 70s. While not always explicitly framed within feminist discourse and often offering contradictory and troubling views of rape and sexual exchange, these films stake a claim for female mobility against security and stability as a form of resistance, intimating the possibility, however tenuous and temporary, of extraordinary freedom. At the same time, this film cycle discloses a moral panic engendered by the seeming threat of young women running away from home, asserting their sexual freedom and claiming their right to the road. And I'll also discuss a very minimal film noir cycle that primarily focuses on men, and that has to do with sort of a panic about cars and the interstate highway. Chapter 4 considers the homeless, street people in the late 80s and early 90s. And these films oscillate between demonizing the homeless as deviant, criminal, and disgusting on the one hand, and on the other, fetishizing them as having transformative and even magical powers. And then the final chapter focuses on the contemporary precariat and looks at a kind of perpetual motion, hypermobility in place. The characters are in constant motion, in open-ended picaresque narratives with no sense of terminus or destination, representing a fragmented and concealed underclass. As the certainty of moving up has diminished, these resolutely realist films reveal the normative orientation itself, assumptions about social mobility and the ability to successfully enter adulthood, having a home, a family, as having been bent, distorted, or derailed. In many cases, characters in these films are also experiencing the effects of being unhomed via immigration and inequities related to race. And this is from about 2008 forward. Taken together, what I hope to show is that mobility and placelessness are absolutely central to the American cinematic imagination. And this is related to the poll, that cinema is absolutely central to how we imagine mobility and placelessness. While these stories appear to be marginal, trend-driven narratives of people on the margins, they're in conversation with more conventional narratives of success, social mobility, and home. They are the flip side. Rather than marginal, these cycles of films about unhomed figures remind us that genres of precarity have been central to the American cinema and American story all along. These precarious narratives, in effect, unhome dominant narratives about American cinema as a cinema focused on ideologies of success and social mobility. Thanks. Come out of the share.
Thank you very much. That was great. We have a lot to talk in the discussion. Our next speaker, Mr. Ezra Glenn. Ezra, please.
Okay, let me just pull this up. Okay. All right.
Great.
Great. It's really nice to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation, and also just for the opportunity to meet with the other panelists, because I really actually am really looking forward to the discussion. You know, it's so tough to see Pam only cram a whole book into 7 minutes. And I think there's a lot we can unpack there. I think the good news is I think we'll see some similarities in what she was talking about and what I'm talking about. I just to quickly orient you, I teach at MIT in the urban planning program. It's an applied program. We do have a small undergraduate urban studies program as well. And about 15 years ago, I started teaching a course in the city and film. And it was originally, the idea was to use film as kind of bait to get the undergraduates in to think about cities. The idea was that often undergrads have a hard time when you ask them to think about something and talk about it. They don't know what they're supposed to say. And what we've realized is with film, everybody has opinions about things. And I think that's a really nice way to sort of engage people in thinking about the world around them. So actually, there's another course I teach in the off semester, which is this Wanderings in Psychogeography. You can see it on the screen there. And it's similar that, you know, it's very much trying to engage people to think more deeply about the world around them. And what I love about film is it forces you to sit down, close your mouth, open your eyes and ears, and think about what you're seeing. Not to just be passive, but to be an active viewer, an active thinker, and then you take those skills out in the world with you and think about the city around you. And I think that's really the first step in being a good planner. So more often than not, I actually wind up getting really excited about the graduate students who wind up in the class, because they're immediately thinking about how are they going to use this stuff to change and reshape cities. So I want to back up a little bit and just sort of talk about, I think I really took to heart your invitation to think about how mobility influences cinema and also how cinema influences mobility. So I started by just going back to the question of sort of what do people think about when they think about a city? I think that's really kind of at the heart of a lot of this. And it's, of course, hard to know what people think about because they do it in their heads, right? So we know what they talk about and what they show and what they do. You know, and of course, it's even harder when you're talking about historically because you can't actually talk to the people. So I wanted to just get a quick sense of what, you know, what does urban mean going further back? And, you know, as a visual guy who thinks a lot about cinema, I thought, well, they don't have film back then, but they do have, you know, paintings and drawings and that sort of stuff. So I pulled up a bunch and started thinking about it, and I noticed there's some real themes. When people depict cities in the past, you can see there's some themes that often come up. Walls and spires are really key. These you can see a couple images there. There's, you know, thousands of these. I mean, that for centuries, the city was really defined as the place where all the buildings are behind the wall, right? You know, you have cities inside the wall and countryside outside. So you have that. Inside that wall, you have you'll notice the kind of clustering of the buildings and the height and the crowds. The crowds come together for commerce, for interaction. These are things that are not unusual. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising to see any of this in a city, right? And I think all of our modern day cities include all this stuff. But what you even at a certain time get industry, smokestacks, another kind of spire. But what you don't see is a ton of motion. That really changes right at the end of the 1800s. And one of the earliest films that, you know, that sort of celebrated is this, the arrival of a train at a station. And here you can see it animated there. This is one of the first depictions on film of an urban scene. And you can see right off the bat, it is defined by motion. And I think this is very much what Pam was saying, is that film is fundamentally about motion. It's moving picture. Even before there's sound, even before there's color, there is motion. And when you start getting depictions of cities in film, we really start to notice that aspect of cities gets played up. They're still tall, they're still crowded, they're still smoky, but they're also in motion all the time. So this is 1895. We can move just 30 years later. And I say just 30 years. I know anyone who's 30 years old in the audience realizes 30 years is a long time. But in terms of history, it's pretty quick, right? You know, we're sort of basically moved from films being these really quick, short things you might see, you know, at a kinescope or at a demonstration, to being 30 years later, you start to get the full hour-and-a-half long, come sit down and watch it. And there's a really classic film that it's in almost every college class about the history of cinema. Berlin Symphony of a Great City. And I use this in my class because it really is sort of in the title even. We're going to make a movie that is about nothing but a city. And the film actually begins, that's the opening scene right there. It begins not in Berlin, but on a train hurtling towards Berlin. So the very first thing you see after the title sequence resolves is the speed of motion hurtling into the city of Berlin on a train. And actually, one thing I have to point out to the students right then is we often see trains as these sort of old-fashioned things, these sort of lumbering, smoky hulks of machines. In 1927, that was like watching a rocket ship, right? I mean, this is the most exciting form of technology and mobility was the train. And sort of to begin your movie with that really sort of established it. This is going to be a movie about a high-tech, future-oriented city. The one difference between a rocket ship and a train is that a train goes towards somewhere, not just away. And so where it goes towards is the city of Berlin. And when we arrive there, what you see is an hour-and-a-half long city in motion. It is multiple forms of mobility on layers. Everything is moving. The people are moving, the trolley cars are on elevated. You see trapezes, you see airplanes, you see horses, you see really everything moving. It's a bustling motion city. Right around the same time in Russia, you get Man with a Movie Camera, also another classic film. Here, they really take the camera and start moving it around. So not only is the city in motion, the camera is in motion. And it really drives home this energy. This really reaches a frenzied pace. And this is actually something that films and urbanists explore for the next 100 years, basically, is the speed and frenzy of cities. The film of Metropolis is another classic one, and that I like to include because it sort of mixes mobility and verticality. You can see in the picture on the right, the airplanes, the elevated layers of highways. You can see on the left, they actually have no subways, they have elevators moving up and down through the city. These are sort of some of the early forms of mobility depicted on screen, and they really, over the next decades, we begin to explore those. I wanted to very quickly just show how films helps us actually think about the problems of mobility as well. We get excited about it, but we also raise some issues. And number one, mobility equals freedom and opportunity. And here's some pictures from The Naked City from 1948, New York City, finally getting its spotlight right in the post-war years. It's a city that is fully in motion, but that motion comes with some danger. The film is largely about a serial killer on the loose in New York. Police need to capture him, and it is incredibly frustrating how easy it is to evade the police in a city with as many forms of motion as New York has. So he escapes on a train, he escapes down a fire escape, he escapes over bridges. Secondly, this is the same year, but back in post-war Italy, another classic film, Bicycle Thieves. The early scenes show our hero, Antonio Ricci there, who gets a new job and has a bicycle to be able to do it. He needs the bike to bike around the city. It is the most delightful opening sequence when you see him riding this bike to his new job, smiling. There he's with his son. But of course, as the title tells us, he's going to lose the bike. And you realize that cities built on mobility and freedom and opportunity also have the downside that you could get stuck, you could lose mobility. So I'd love to explore some of those themes. I don't think they're rooted in 1927 or 1948, but they really extend throughout the 150-year period we're going to talk about. So I think I'm out of time. Hopefully I've seeded the discussion. So.
Great, thank you, Ezra. Yes, we have a lot to talk in the discussion. So I invite our third speaker, Mr. Steve Harper. Steve, please. You have the share screen.
Well, good afternoon. I've been a car designer now for over 40 years. So during that time, I've perhaps been involved in more than 250 projects that have been focused on transport and movement of people. So what I'm now looking at is how cinema has influenced us as designers and in many ways also as consumers. Like I said, I've been working on everything from car design through to trucks, through to buses, a great range of different products over the years. And today we've moved on a little bit more from pure focusing on cars and motorbikes, but you know, we're starting to move into more ways of thinking about new forms of transport. So it's about taking it forward. And where do the designers of today get their influence? So to look at that, I looked at myself. Where did my influences? And it's good that Ezra mentioned Metropolis, because for me, that was its Blade Runner of its times. It was showing the potential for a future of these new types of cities, things to come, but with the H.G. Wells, Alex Korda's movie, they all had wonderful views of what this future was going to bring to us. And, you know, the B movie on Saturday morning, watching Flash Gordon, must have thrilled thousands of kids who probably then went on to become designers and introduce the kind of rocket age styling. There are also many ways of looking at the idea of, you know, how we use transport and things like that. And for me, Brazil was a very simple way of showing how a very simple form of transport, this was the German Messerschmitt, could be used as a simple vehicle. In fact, I know these car personally because I used to sit on my mother's lap when my father was driving one. So it was probably my first ever car I was in. But in Britain, we had a very good company called, through a filmmaker called Jerry Anderson. And he made films as well as TV and made some of these puppet shows that became instant successes globally, showing fantastic ideas of vehicles in motion, whether it was drilling holes in the ground, rescuing people, fighting aliens, or just flying around. So all these types of vehicles had uses that were kind of inspiring us. But the other inspiration was the idea of freedom. What transport was giving us was the idea of freedom, right from the wild ones through to Easy Riders, Vanishing Point, Bullet, Thelma and Louise, Two-Lane Blacktop. It was about this idea of freedom that was inspiring to many as they were coming out of that post-war sort of slumber. But there was also the classics by H.G. Wells and people like that, and the visions of H.G. Wells and Arthur C. Clarke showed that there was another level, and even Star Trek, you know, with they kind of preempted the Ericsson T-28 telephone and had ideas of beaming you through space, through a vacuum of space. Perhaps this is possible. Is it part of this endless consumerism, faster and simpler? But there was also the fun aspect. And I think one of the things that every child identified with was with the idea of cars becoming friends, the faces on the front of Thomas the Tank Engine and things like that, that really kind of identified it as almost a human values. And whether you consider the cat bus of Totoro or Harry Potter's broomstick, the Jetsons had this car that you'd flow there and leapt out and it fitted into a suitcase. It all collapsed into a suitcase. These are the sort of things today designers at the colleges are actually starting to think about. So yes, film does influence design, it does influence how we start to think about transport in the future. Is there such a thing as the flying carpet? I mean, Bond always had these amazing gadgets, whether the auto gyro, the rocket pack, the submarine. These influenced, but also started people discussing alternative forms of transport. Major cities around the world and a lot of transport is by public transport today. And one of the things that kind of often scares us away from public transport is this kind of negativity that comes out in many films like Murder on the Orient Express, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, where poor old Steve Martin's having to deal with, you know, with the oddness of being caught in missing perfect transport. And of course, Sliding Doors, where a momentary delay can cause your life to take on two different kinds of destiny. Kids are the heart of looking at movies, watching TV, and it's their ideas that sort of start to sort of move us forward. I mean, Marty's hoverboard became a weird Chinese thing that was a balancing screen. It wasn't really a hoverboard, but they kind of sold it for a while, and everybody dreams about having rocket-propelled boots. And Batman's motorbike that appeared out the front of his car. He was a hero, superheroes. They always had the most exotic forms of mobility that perhaps inspired others. But there was this blue sky and black sky scenarios, and Blade Runner showed us the crowded cities, the dense population, the rain, but it also had flying cars. Star Wars, so many ideas bouncing backwards and forwards, inspiring perhaps somebody to go off and make a pod racer. Let's wait and see, because it's still possible. Tron, what we saw there were interesting digital ideas to reality. And now what we're actually starting to see is people making bikes like Tron. People want to explore the expressions and feelings they saw in the movies. I mean, even something like Cheech and Chong's Up in Smoke, where they made the car out of hash, so to get it across the border, and unfortunately it caught a spark and caught light and they all got stoned, but actually making a vehicle out of hemp is a possibility. We don't have to make it out of steel like the big Detroit cars. So, you know, even there we're seeing something new. How we upcycle, re-energize existing cars. When a lot of people are making classic cars into EVs. You know, Marty and Doc on Back to the Future had a kind of vehicle that was re-energized, as was the taxis and so things like that. So we could even be looking in the future of how we use existing forms of transport and upcycle them. But transport for me is more about not just the urban, suburban, rural and remote communities. It has to be something that's personal. It can't be boring. I mean, the Johnny Cab of when Arnie rips off the head of the Johnny Cab because it's frustrating him. That's not what we want as a future of transport for us. They've got to have soul. It's got to be fun. So what would I say? My influences for the next generation. I love Jacques Tati, and his Monsieur Hureau's Holiday was one of my favorite films. And one of my favorite parts of that was his car. It was a simple car, but it gave him that escape. It got out of the city and allowed him to go to the beach. And that was just a beauty to behold. So what is the next generation of inspiration? Well, hybrids. And what sort of hybrids? Well, maybe they could even be self-propelled. I mean, we see the Flintstones pushing the car along, walking along the car to keep them all together and keep them dry. So why don't we do that? Perhaps that could be the next generation of transport. But ultimately, what do we really want with mobility? We want to be able to get somewhere as simply and easily as possible. So my next generation of inspiration is Mary Poppins. The infinity bag and an umbrella that you just open and you can pop from one place to the other. You don't have to be beamed into pieces like Star Trek, but actually Mary Poppins captures the whole idea. Thanks, Kelly, for that one. So that's, for me, is the future of transport. It's something that enables us to get the freedom to get away from the cities, to the commercialism, and just be ourselves. And I think that, for me, is what the influence of cinema has been to a designer, and I hope it continues to be, because many designers now work in the field of cinema, doing things like Blade Runner and other films like that. So I'd love to see more designers getting into film, because it really then will stimulate conversation about the future of transport and mobility. Okay, so building a better future. Hope we choose to get there soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Steve. 3 excellent talks. Thanks, everyone. So before I ask the audience and ask my own questions, if Steve, Ezra, or Pam have any question from one another, please just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
I'll start.
Please go ahead.
Thank you both for that. That was really interesting. And it's interesting to see Steve's thing about cinema's influence on industrial design. And I was wondering, Ezra, when you're teaching the city and film and looking at things like city symphonies and things, how much you're thinking about that kind of mutual influence, or what direction it goes, or what kind of history lessons, you know, your students who are doing urban planning are learning. I mean, one of the things I always love about silent cinema is the insanity of the traffic. You know, you look at something like Sunrise or Man with a Movie Camera and you just think, you know, death is around every possible corner because all the vehicles are going, you know, all this. And I wonder how much, you know, your students are thinking about that back to their work in urban planning, or how you're thinking about that relationship.
Sure. No, it's a great question. Just to start, there is one thing I always have to caution them on, especially when we're dealing with silent films, that some of the best parts of cities come across very well in silent films. You know, sort of the motion, the sort of joy of the kind of, you know, the eclecticism, the vibrancy. I always have to remind them that when you don't have the sounds and smells, which are 2 of the things people most complain about in cities, it's kind of an unfair, it's false advertising, right? But that said, even with those silent films, you notice quite a lot of films really, they explore that motion and get excited about it, but also point out the dangers of it. I mean, even the films you were showing, like, I mean, Modern Times has this wonderful sequence where Chaplin, he has a mental breakdown. He goes into the he gets locked up in a sanatorium for a week or two, and then they send him back out and they say, just avoid any excitement, right? And then he winds up on the city and suddenly everything's moving again, right? And you just know there's no way he can be calm in this kind of crazy environment. And I think a lot of the films really do explore that. And so in terms of the students, I actually use it as an opportunity to get them to stop and think about the pros and cons of everything. I think that film is really a wonderful way to bring people together to think about the full experience of a city. I think it actually connects a little bit with the stuff Steve was presenting. I think often in the sort of worse science fiction films will throw all kinds of really cool gadgets and gizmos and new inventions and not fully explore, well, what would really happen to society if that were implemented, right? The better ones sort of use the film as a speculative space to think, okay, this thing is cool, but what are going to be the second and third order impacts? And I think that's sort of what you want to get the students and the planners and even the community thinking, because these changes are happening, and ideally we want to be mindful of them. Can I follow that with a question then
Yes.
I mean, so it does seem like a key component here is getting excited about the freedom that mobility provides, but also realizing, well, wait a second, what's the world where everyone has freedom? That kind of seems like a world of chaos, right? And I think this isn't, especially here on this side of the Atlantic, this is the American dilemma, is how can we have a world where everyone is free, but nobody bugs anybody, right? Because my freedom very quickly starts meaning I bug you, right? And so I guess I would be interested in what either, Pamela in the work on the placelessness and in the economic mobility problems, or Steve with these really sort of cool new inventions. I mean, have we figured out ways to deliver limitless mobility without the need to coordinate it?
Steve, do you like to first share your thoughts? You're mute.
Yeah, okay. That's good, interesting point, Ezra. I think one of the key points about this idea of freedom, freedom and mobility, and the one thing perhaps that we've learned during this the pandemic lockdowns and whatever is, and it also came across in something that Pamela said, was about mobility is the movement of people and things. And one thing that we've learned now is perhaps that instead of us traveling to somewhere, things can come to us, i.e. through the screen or whatever. So although we like to think we're getting these ideas of escapism and escaping from the cities or whatever, we can actually balance it with things coming to us or coming through to us instead. So I think that the idea, I mean, it's interesting, over the last month or so, I think I've driven 70 miles and run 140 miles instead. It's the idea that in the last 6 months, 12 months, life has changed a lot, and how we use that in the future. And the fact that people drive in their big cars, which go around the Nürburgring in 14.7 minutes or whatever it is, and then use it to pop down to the supermarket, just doesn't seem right. And as a designer now, one of the things I'm really sort of focusing on is, yes, we want this freedom. We don't want to be stuck on a bus with somebody else wearing a mask, wondering who they met the night before. We want to still have that idea of our own personal space, your own music, your own environment, but not be so concerned about, you want that freedom, but you don't need to have everything that the car and everything else currently delivers. We can do it in so many better, different ways. So I hope that answers your question.
I don't think there's ever a possibility that everybody would have free movement, because mobility is always constrained by ideologies around race, around sexuality, around gender. I mean, when people talk about traveling while Black, Mia Bay's book, Traveling Black, notes all these different ways in which Black travel has been constrained, regulated, boxed in over more than a century. The work that I'm doing, a lot of it is about kind of moral panics engendered by people's mobility. So with the tramps, you have these cycles of panic about, it's primarily single men traveling, primarily white men. Early on, you know, they're projected onto them immigrant status, but historically it's just not true. It's white native born men. And there's a lot of anxiety about their movement. You know, there's a lot of fear about their proximity, and they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And so there's a lot of anxiety, and I'm just now doing the research on the hitchhiker chapter, and it's the same thing. And there's this sort of tension. Sometimes it's sort of approved and accepted as a sort of thrifty model of travel and economic, and this primarily for white men, white college men particularly. But when it's women, when it's minorities, it becomes policed and constrained. And I think, you know, queer mobility has been constrained in lots of ways and policed and boxed in, so that, you know, there's always a process of sort of deciding who gets to be mobile, who doesn't. You know, we've seen it governmentally in terms of the ways that immigration is managed, and lots of different things. And I think the pandemic has raised a lot of those issues too. Who's forced to be mobile, right? Who had to go out and ride buses and trains to take care of the rest of us? Who was allowed to move to their country house? Who wasn't? So that it's always, you know, in these kind of tensions between sort of who has the right to be mobile and who doesn't. And I think that's always going to underpin any discussion about freedom, right? Who has it? Who has access to it? And there's a lot of different tensions around that.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to hand over to Andrew to manage the question answer, but we had a roundtable on mobility and gender, and actually some of these conversation came up, and especially about the freedom of how freedom is different, really. Before I hand to Andrew, I would like to, one quick question. How do you think movies can, every point that the three panelists spoke about, movies can actually make that influence? Are they really able, do they, as the question in the introduction, are they really just portraying what's out there, or do they have the power to influence? You answered some, but briefly, if you, a few sentences, if everybody could say, that would be great. Ezra, maybe if you can start.
Sure. I think that movies absolutely do have the power to influence people's attitudes. Mm-hmm. And I think people's attitudes are essentially what shape the world around us, right? I think more often than not, and this is true with, you know, with all forms of communication, it's pretty easy to do that on our baser emotions, you know, things like fear, right? Movies very easily can play on fear, and I think did play a big part in, you know, for example, the people starting to fear cities and wanting to flee to the suburbs, right? Movies played that up, you know, and it was a sort of self-reinforcing cycle. That said, I think movies can also encourage people to be more thoughtful and more open-minded about the urban experience, about how their mobility affects others, about the benefits of lack of mobility. You know, I think Steve, you showed Jacques Tati in your you showed Monsieur Hulot in his follow-up Playtime, his magnum opus, really shows all this modern technology helping people move around and be separate from each other. And what the film does over the course of a very amusing 2 hours is shows the people start to bump into each other and get to know each other and settle down. And it's really wonderful. You know, the film is almost like a masterclass in getting to know your neighbors and slowing down and being more human and less technological. So I think it is possible for films to do that as well.
If Steve and Pam has any thought, if not, we can move to Andrew.
I mean, I'd say similarly. Oh, sorry, Steve. Do you want to go?
Go ahead, Pat.
I was just going to say, similar to Ezra, I mean, I think absolutely in terms of sort of ideologies that film can engage and participate. I don't think it's ever a very simple through line. but I think mixed with questions of aesthetics and fantasy, so that, you know, with a lot of things around mobility, a lot of the figures that I'm looking at, I think there's this sort of pull, even as they're being demonized, that, you know, that makes them attractive and makes them interesting. And I think that that tension is always there. But no, I think that film helps shape a lot of the way we view the world, and responds to that. You know, it's sort of in constant conversation with other media, other modes of sort of showing.
Thanks. I think one of the best things Ezra said there is about the influence of open-mindedness. I think we can use movies to increase our awareness, but the only other problem is that when, and somebody's, I think it's Tanya here, has written something about the fact that people then see movies like Fast and Furious and instantly think they're racing drivers. And I think we have to be careful how different groups of people interpret the movies, because, you know, people can see the movie as a piece of art, or they can see it as a major influence and go out and copy it. And, you know, you think about, you know, all those, you know, the Kubrick's other famous film where people started going around in skinhead gangs and beating up old ladies. It's, you know, we don't want the Clockwork Orange kind of lifestyle anymore, but we have to be careful when we're making movies and viewing movies, that the audiences have different levels of way of accepting or interpreting what they see. As a designer, I'm looking at the craft, but actually a good movie has a good storyline, and the objects, the crafts and things are then part of the features that support it. Too many sci-fi films are all bang, 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 boom, and very hollow characters. So it's important that movies have good stories, good characters that perhaps influence us as humans, and the supporting cast of mobility is there to just bring that message home.
Yeah, thanks for that. If I can just jump in with something that struck me. So from Ezra's brief kind of introduction, one thing that you pointed out, Ezra, was the idea that the cities were surrounded by walls, and really this idea of the otherness, separating people like us from the others, the wall, and kind of the way mobility is presented in movies now. The vehicle is the wall, in a way, in that you often see conversations between the characters within the vehicle as they're driving through the city, but they're separate from it. They're part of it, but separate from it. And like the work that you were talking about, Pam, that's all about others, isn't it? The people that aren't the same as me, kind of thing. You know, the otherness and this separation. I just wondered if you might like to comment on this idea of the relationship between mobility and otherness. Sorry, so did you want to say something?
Start with that, Pam, and then
Sure.
I'll go.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I think that the othering of sort of who gets to be mobile, who doesn't, runs throughout, right? It culturally and cinematically. And I think that, you know, the car thing you mentioned is really interesting, because that also dovetails with questions of privacy, right? And issues of mobility, you know, who's moving versus where and what they enter. And one of the interesting things reading about sort of the history of hitchhiking is, as more and more people get cars, that idea of the car as walls comes stronger, right? When fewer people have cars, there's much more a sense of, well, I'll share my space. You know, during the Depression, I think something like 43% of people say they'll give people rides, right? And that starts to seal off increasingly as you get more and more people with cars, because they're each in their own wall. And I think it dovetails with sort of, you know, an increase on individualism versus a sense of community, all of that, and that plays out. At the same time, right, the appeal of those scenes in a car is often what's out the window, right? And sort of the possibility of stopping the car and getting out and having that interaction. So I think it's not just a wall, right? That it has a kind of porousness, or a potential for porousness as well.
Yeah, I think I would very much lean into that. I think with those pictures of the walled cities, the sort of strange thing is all the rich, privileged people are inside the wall, right? And that's the safe place to be. We sort of flipped that and created this sort of gated community suburb with this sort of, this demonized city. I would say I think that the purest, not purest, but the most sort of free form of mobility is actually the the kind of vision of like the flyover country, or in those medieval cities would have been like the elevated walkway where you don't even interact with the poor, right? The scene you're describing though, Andrew, I think you're right that the car creates this bubble, you move around, but exactly as Pam said, there's these moments. I mean, the worst side of this is it's sort of like the city as safari, where you look and you see, you kind of, voyeur, but there are also these moments like, the red light under the underpass when the guy comes and cleans your windshield, right? That you see that in dozens of films. And it's a question of, is this going to be a carjacking, or is this a time to establish that this privileged character can't even interact with a homeless person, right? And so there, I think, again, the better movies give us time to explore those spaces.
It's interesting. I mean, the different companies I've worked for over the years have played very much on this "look at me" attitude. Whether you're driving as you say, your middle-aged Anglo-Saxon white guy or whatever, driving his Lotus or his Bentley or his Rolls-Royce or whatever, and Ferraris or whatever, it's kind of "look at me." And nobody drives around in a glass car, an all glass car where they can be seen. On Rolls-Royce, I can remember they saying, well, we've got to make the rear quarter really thick because the people who drive in our cars don't want to be seen. And it's like, well, you've got the most expensive car, but you don't want to be seen to be in it. No, it's for privacy. So we've got this dichotomy of this idea of privacy and snobbery about the different types of transport. I mean, even something as humble as a bicycle, you can pick up one out of the river or whatever and use it, but then there's somebody else will go past you on a $3,000, $5,000 mountain bike, and it's kind of, they're all playing this snobbery. I've got this, I'm better than you. And there is this weird thing about transport that, I can remember the first time I was in China in 1987, 1988, and there was this bus go by and the people were crammed in there, faces against the side, and there was a single 40-watt light bulb inside the kind of bus lighting it all up. That was them. They had transport, but looking at it from a Western perspective, you felt sorry for those people. Well, they were crammed into that bus, but they were happy they were not, at least not on a bicycle. So it's really playing to all those levels of class, I think, as well. And I think the city is particularly noted for having these levels of class and attitudes that perhaps living outside the city, you don't have so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So time is kind of moving on, and I don't think this would be a discussion related to cinema would be complete without asking you the question about which do you consider to be the film that has had the biggest influence on shaping forms of mobility and transport in the developed world. So perhaps for me, the dystopian view in Blade Runner seems to be not a good destination. That would be, but so what would the panelists suggest as a kind of favorite film in terms of being influential?
You picked me to the post with Blade Runner, I think. Yeah, I mean there are many, but like I say, that Jacques Tati film, Mr. Hulot's Holiday, it just shows the simplicity of life, and if you have that extra bit of mobility, the ability to just go that little bit further. So although the dystopian future, the black sky of Blade Runner is the film I've watched the most, Jacques Tati comes in number 2 because it's the blue sky, the idea of transport just being, or mobility being a way to find that a little bit more freedom, get away from the city.
Thank you. Pam or Ezra, do you have any comments?
I never can whittle things down, because films do so many different things that I can't say like this thing does, you know, so I refuse the question. I can't do it.
Pam took my answer, so now I have to come up with something else. I mean, I think, yeah, I often encourage the students to look at every film for what it has to offer. You know, that said, I will actually give a shout out for very early. I think Charlie Chaplin. It is hard. I mean, not a single film, but his entire work. It's hard to imagine somebody who more changed our vision of what cinema could do, and fairly low cinema. You know, very popular cinema that showed people how you could spend some time thinking about someone who wasn't you, or if you were like him, you could say my stories deserve to be up on the big screen. And I think for both groups, he was a real bridge builder there. And, you know, it seems kind of old fashioned now, but I think I read it as late as the year 2000. Chaplin's Tramp was still the #1 most recognized fictional character in the world. More than Mickey Mouse was his Tramp. And I thought that was pretty impressive. Also, because of this, you got to remember, in the silent era, these films went all around the globe, and everybody thought they were their films. So I think in terms of pushing at the inclusiveness of cinema, I think, you know, with Pam's concerns, you know, notwithstanding. So.
Thank you. Thanks. So do you want to finish off, Mojtaba?
We had actually some amazing questions in the chat area. I'm sorry, like usual, we didn't get to answer all of them, but I actually will copy them and try to at least communicate with the people who asked the question. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ezra. Thank you, Pam. It was an excellent roundtable. And we were really delighted to have you all here to have this amazing, lively conversation, insightful. And also plug our next roundtable is on mobility and aging on 15th of July. We will send out the details shortly, and hope to see you then, and wishing you a lovely rest of the week. Great to see everyone. Thank you for coming.